Custodes have to be one of these factions, not the faction, that you can either paint super quickly or spend months defining every tiny detail, only to find out an entirely new edition rolls around right as you finish your 2000 points army. And honestly, that's kind of their whole identity baked into the design. And the golden armor of the Adeptus Custodes looks like it should demand hours of blending, layering, and obsessive edge highlighting. But at the same time, it's also one of the most forgiving paint schemes in the entire setting if you approach it the right way. Once you lean into metallics and a few smart contrast choices, you can get something that looks exquisite on the table without applying millions of brush strokes per model. I did both, so I know what I'm talking about, and as much as I enjoyed painting up these glorious shapes to perfection, in this video I'm going to take the second route, fast and effective, and I'll show you how far you can push Custodes with surprisingly little effort, while still keeping that elite, godlike presence they are supposed to have on the battlefield. Thanks a lot to my LGS and huge supporter of this channel, Siren Games, for providing these miniatures. If you're looking for a reliable source of Warhammer and just about any tabletop game out there in Central Europe, there's a link in the description. Go check them out. The new Custodes received some really cool upgrades compared to the old ones. No more squatting poses, the detailing improved in some strategic places like the loincloths. They don't look like skimpy miniskirts anymore. There's some serious dangling going on now. The cloaks and their fold patterns look absolutely amazing, and I like the added details on the chest plates. I mean the aiglettes and bigger gemstones. No idea what you were thinking of there. I think the old helmets offered a bit more variety when it comes to painting them, but then again, I think I like the new shape and they definitely are a bit more delicate. Here's what I didn't like. The helmets sink into the chest part, and this is supposed to make them look like these heavy units protected by layers of armor. And I get it, and somehow like how the heads without helmets fit into that, but the helmets with the plumes just make it so they only work with a very limited range of directions. Like on this guy, it would be fine if he looked to his right, but the pose just kinda calls for him looking to the left. But the plume just collides with the shoulder. The easy way would have been to give into the monopose and position the head so there was no interference. But I'm a stubborn bastard, so instead I pressed a ball of putty into the socket, made the head part wet, and pressed it into the clay to create another higher socket, which would allow for the pose I wanted to work. Now, I usually don't like putting minis on flat bases, but to make the way the cloaks are sculpted work with raised terrain, you still need a large flat surface. For my Custodes, I picked out these urban rubble parts by Epic Basing that I printed, but I had to get rid of a few elements to get these large flat surfaces. Cutting resin with a hobby knife isn't a great experience though, so I used my rotary tool. I only took 2 seconds of footage though, and did the rest of it outside, because there's small creatures living in this basement occasionally and I don't want to poison them. I glued this element to the base, I double checked if there was enough room so the cloak wouldn't overhang, and then added some smaller elements to build a bit of variety. Then I dumped some gravel filler on and primed the mini. I picked up these Vallejo Liquid Metal pots a while ago, and honestly, for a larger Custodes project, I would not use anything else. These are alcohol based and there is some serious stuff going on with these. I could look at these patterns all day. Whatever you do, don't actually pour them out though, like I did. I just wanted that shot. I just used them straight out of the bottle. They kind of lose their desirable properties when they dry. The point here is just look at how smooth this gold goes on. It covers mostly in one layer and it creeps into all these pesky recesses Custodes armor has. And this is probably even faster with an airbrush, but honestly, even using a brush, it was so quick I didn't even think about trying the airbrush at all. If I had to paint a lot of these, this would be the base color for my choice any day. The result looks really shiny, and I also like the color tone. Of course, it's a little bit desaturated, but that doesn't really matter because we will add some depth here in a minute. But before that, I cleaned up all the spill with black, mainly because this gold is so intense it would probably need a few layers more with any other paint. And I also picked out the gems with black to have a clean slate to start from. I was never a fan of traditional wallets. Way too big, way too unpractical, and always falling apart after a few months. That's why I'm so glad I found Exter, the company behind the Messy wallet and their great wallet solutions. I have been using mine for a few months now, and the material is still pristine. The leather generally feels great to touch and high quality. It's compact and yet offers room for 12 individual cards and space for cash. To get to your cards, all you have to do is press this mechanism down here and the cards pop right out. It even spreads them out so you can see them all and can access the one you need without any trouble. Not only is this super practical, it's also kinda fun. The wallet has built-in RFI protection that will protect your data from getting stolen, and if you ever lose it or misplace it, you can just ping the wallet finder card with your Android or iPhone. Another thing I picked up from Exeter is this vacuum travel kit that compresses clothing by 60%, so you have more space in your suitcase for minis or that sweet convention loot. This kit comes with a handy vacuum pump that sucks the air out from the bag in minutes. The bag itself is made from nylon and designed for hygiene and longevity. Right now they're running a huge Father's Day sale until the 24th of June, which means all extra products will be 53% off, and if you're using my code, you'll get an additional 20% off, bringing the total discount up to a fantastic 73%. So follow the link in the description and use my code to grab this massive discount. Thanks a lot to Exeter for sponsoring this video, and now back to my Custodes. I'm going to add a few layers over this gold, and each one will have a very particular purpose. So first I'm mixing burnt sienna ink with contrast medium. That gives me the coverage and color intensity of the ink, but also the behavior of contrast paint, meaning it will creep into these recesses and create gradients towards the raised parts that are not covered as much. With this first layer, I'm not paying that much attention to where it goes, as long as the recesses are stained. I guess I might have done it a little unconsciously already though. For example, on that plate that covers the terrouge. I don't feel pretentious at all saying that. And I already built two gradients that run counter to each other like you would do with non-metallic metal. But again, I just want to make sure that the recesses are covered, and in fact, if there was too much pooling in some areas, like under the chest plate, I would soak that up or spread it around a bit more in order not to cover too much surface. As you can see, this adds a nice warm orange tone to the gold, and in this context the main color looks more yellow too, which is exactly the effect I was after. If you want to go super speedy, add a second wash like this once the first one is dry and you're ready to go. Personally, I'm switching to pure burnt sienna ink at this point and doing a little pigment pushing. I'm guiding the ink towards areas I want shaded. First of all recesses that were not stained as much as I wanted to, and also around any feature I wanted to darkline a little more, like these aquillas on the front plate. Next, I'm building the reflection patterns. My main light source usually coming from top right. So I'm shading every plate that's facing away from that, and every plate facing it remains rather bright. It's most evident on the legs at that point, but I'm also building shadows on the plates of the armor midsection in the same way. And generally, any area where two surfaces meet at an angle get a similar treatment. You can see how I'm building these gradients with thin layers of paint, and I'll push these pigments away from the brighter parts and lift my brush off in the darker area, so the pigment accumulates there as usual. Almost all of the armor parts have at least one area that's angled against another, so I just keep shading everything in the same way: front of the helmet, shoulders, hip protectors. At this point it's important to be patient and let one layer dry before moving on to the next, and I generally apply about 2 to 3 thin layers until I'm happy with the result. Now you could argue that everything looks a little bit too orange at this point, and you'd be right. So I'm whipping out the umber ink and I start to darkline most of the features to create more depth and also to darken the gold overall. As you can see, one glaze layer is usually enough for most areas, like that lower angle of the hip protector, on the knee, the legs, the shield, shoulders. You get the idea. Now that we got the shading down, we need to bring back some shine and also put in some highlights. And to everyone's surprise, I'm using tainted gold for that. What can I say? This paint is fun, super easy to create highlights with without any coffee staining, just by using thin glazes. Honestly, this stuff feels borderline illegal compared to the suffering I used to go through highlighting gold with any other paint. Some people like to add silver as highlights for gold. I don't really like that. I feel like that kills the gold vibe a little for me, and tainted gold brings back the shine without turning too white. Of course, I'm also picking out edges, making sure to put some bright highlights next to dark shadows, just to make sure I'm increasing contrast and getting some shine back. I'm not really focusing on every edge though, just the higher up ones and some of the more prominent ones, like the detail on the shoulder and also some parts of the helmet. You could of course do it all over the mini, but like me, you probably have other things to do than staring at a golden dude with magnifying glasses for hours on end. For the leather, I used brown straight over black, leaving some of that to show as a shade color, and then gradually added more beige for the highlights. I'm not gonna lie, this next part is what I enjoyed the most. The fold patterns are just so much fun to work with. Sometimes I wonder what normal people get emotionally invested in like I do with tiny fabric creases. I was using a wine red and basically just blocked in a layer of color on each of the major shapes with roughly 70 to 30 mix of paint and water, leaving some black in the recesses. And then I thinned down the wine red even more and glazed over the edges to soften the transitions. I did all of this to set up a desaturated red as a base. So next I used pure wine red and placed it on all the areas I wanted one step brighter, and then used the same glazing trick to blend it with the rest. At this point I added a little turquoise ink to the wine red until I hit a nice purple mix and slapped that on the lower part of the cloak. While this was somewhat wet, still I blended it together with thinned down wine red again. Just one of these trust the process moments where the miniature temporarily looks worse with every step until suddenly it does. And the ink was great for the gradient, but I needed a bit more coverage to make the purple show more. So I switched to regular turquoise paint and wet blended a transition again. And then using pure turquoise, I blocked in the highlights in the lower parts, also framing that edge of the cloak in this color with an edge highlight. And then I used a previous mix as a wash to draw it all together. At this point, it was slowly evolving into a playable synthwave album cover, and honestly, I wasn't even mad about it. To set up the last highlight, I used a 50-50 mix of wine red and scarlet blood, which created a mid-tone value, and I layered that on rather thick. And even though it blended together really well without much effort, simply because the value difference wasn't too big, it started showing that saturation now that I was after to contrast the rest of the cape with the final highlights. Some thinned down layers over the transitional areas made the red and purple flow into each other more naturally, and then I busted out the white and covered the highest parts of the folds in a thick coat, which always feels deeply wrong in the moment because for about 30 seconds it looks like someone vandalized the cloak with correction fluid. I used the thinner glaze to fade out the edges to have some saturation in these areas once I would cover this with the brighter red, but also to make it fade more into the layer below that. Then as I use pure scarlet blots, I hope you can see the intention behind this and how it's all coming together. I started a bit more carefully, thinning the red down, but it got evident soon that I could just use this more or less undiluted for the effect to work. And this was a bit of a back and forth, but I rarely have everything figured out when I start painting. I just had a rough idea and had to dial in gradually. I wanted to use the same principle for the plume, so I built the base color, added the purple to the lower parts, brought out the mid-tone red and slapped some white on, and then added the bright red over that. I wasn't quite happy with the outline of the cloak, so I switched it from a dark turquoise to gray, and I stippled that on carefully, making it look a little rugged in that area, but it also played into that saturation, desaturation contrast from top to bottom. For the plume, I added one brighter layer of orange at the top and added the grayish color I used for the bottom of the cloak to the ends of the plume as well, shading more into black and pushing the highlights up to white. I defined the aigulets and also the handles of the Guardian Spear in wine red. I popped a little white on in strategic places and covered that with bright scarlet red. With that much red already on the mini, I knew that using red again was not an option for the gemstones. I already had a little turquoise in there, so I decided to also do them in this color. I tried to do a little fancier pattern on the big gem on the chest, so I did the usual crest on the lower side and then went for a larger separate circle above it. And I gave the other gems the typical treatment. I had to darken some parts with turquoise ink again and then plopped down the white dots for the specular lights. Gemstones are always fun to do because a tiny white dot suddenly transforms them from painted circle into ancient relic of immeasurable value. I slapped some burnt umber ink over the sketch I did for the leather to draw the gradients together, but also to make the brown a bit richer. And I did the same for the terrouge. I also wanted to have a little fun with the blade of the polearm, so I painted the edge in aquamarine, which took 2 layers to cover, And then I applied some lightning patterns right over the black on the rest of the blade. Because if there is anything over-designed golden superhuman soldiers need, it's more drama. I actually had to warm up a little, finding the right shapes and thickness, but eventually I liked the result. I also painted an outline around the eagle wing to indicate that there's some glow coming from that area, or it's maybe even the source of the crackling energy. And then it also felt right to wash the feathers with a thin layer of aquamarine. I put down dots of pure white, mostly trying to put a smaller line inside the turquoise lines. I also hit all the edges of the scalp, focusing it mainly on these curvy areas. I then loaded white ink into my airbrush, thinned it down a lot and set the pressure really low and still pushed down the trigger a little too much with the first blast. Classic airbrush moment. You spend 10 minutes carefully preparing everything and then immediately sneeze white paint all over it. To fix that, I had to make that reflection a little wider than planned because I wanted to cover the spider webbing. But it still turned out okay. I tried not to have too much overspray onto the black, but the idea was to have a little spill to create the glare effect. I also sprayed a little highlight on that lower curve and then also sprayed a very confined glare effect on the area where the crackling energy originated near the wing. Finally, I brought back some of that edge highlight and a few dots of pure white in the energy effects. I gave the base a quick coat of dark green and then slapped on a dark beige brown to create some variety. And next I highlighted this up by dabbing on some lighter blue grays and the last edge highlight with the brightest beige I could find. Then I dumped some pigment into the recesses and fixed it in place with water. So this is a great way to paint some awesome Custodes. I like the look of the gold and also that it's such a quick method if you want to paint a couple of them at once. The cloak took a bit longer because it was a bit of a back and forth to figure out the approach, but I like the result a lot. It almost looks a little neon with the intense red against the darker purple colors, almost like the Emperor's personal bodyguard wandered into a cyberpunk nightclub by mistake. And finally, the blade of the Guardian spear turned out so well considering how quick it was. I especially like the glare effects and the crackling energy. I'm definitely going to paint at least one more Custodes in a different style because I just really like the sculpts. Let me know if you want to see any particular approaches or styles and let me know if you like this result. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment and see you in the next one.